Fallout is, of course, set in America, and I am no American, but I do know that the founding fathers are quite important. Would you still be able to uphold democracy in this godforsaken wasteland? So the question is, can you beat Fallout 4 as a founding father? Now today's video was meant to be can you beat Fallout 4 survival difficulty as a stormtrooper, but the gear we had was just too OP, so here is where we are. Today's rules are as follows. I can only use gear that a founding father would have access to, so this means the weapons are the revolutionary sword, laser musket, and one secret weapon I will reveal later. No other weapons will be allowed. Even though repeaters did exist during the Revolutionary War, I didn't want to use them because in Fallout they are quite OP. To beat today's run, we have 3 goals. First and foremost is to uphold the democratic values of our great nation. Second, I'm gonna try and kill any British references I come across. And finally, we must beat the game. Power armor is banned and we will be playing on hard difficulty. I also will be using a revolutionary suit that I found with the mod, which I added a little bit later into the recording. And with that out of the way, let's begin. I decided of the main founding fathers, George Washington is the most popular, so he is the one I will play as today. I admired the beautiful flag of America in my home and then made my special stats. You'll be surprised to know George Washington was actually very built, so that's why he has an 8 in strength. I then watched the bombs go off from the communist scum, or so I think, and my wife was killed. To escape Vault 111, we of course locked all the roaches behind the doors and moved on. Out in the wasteland, I went to Red Rocket and picked up Dogmeat. Dogmeat will be following us today because George Washington was very fond of animals and actually had 12 dogs, so the sources say. Moving on, at the Museum of Freedom, I got access to the laser musket, our first weapon, which was just outside the front. The musket is actually a fun weapon, dealing some decent damage, especially against these early game raiders. I cleared the front of the museum with no problem, and then inside I got to more blasting, taking out each raider with a hot dosage of democracy. On the roof of the museum, I delivered some Commonwealth justice by taking out the raiders from afar, until I was killed by a Molotov from a guy with a mean throwing arm. I then continued taking out the raiders and showed Preston how easy it is to actually aim. Sadly though, I was out of fusion cells by the time the Death Claw spawned, so I made a retreat. To kill this redcoat beast, redcoat is an insult for English colonists, I would need more fusion cells or a revolutionary sword. Lucky for us, Trudy sells a revolutionary sword, but not lucky for us, she's being harassed by drug dealers. I told Trudy I would help her in the shootout, and instead I hid inside. I then watched Wolfgang get literally decimated in seconds, followed by Simone. Why Trudy even needed support is beyond me, they can clearly shoot fine. Now Trudy sells a revolutionary sword called General Chow's Revenge, and I couldn't afford it, even if I sold my whole inventory. Lucky for me though, Starlight Drive-In is very close, and I could scrap it and sell it to Trudy. At the drive-in, I gun bashed the mole rats, which was fine, and then scrapped all the cars and trees among other stuff I could find. I then took the wood and metal I got back to Trudy and sold it to her, plus the stuff from Wolfgang and Simone's body, which left me with just enough caps to buy the revolutionary sword. Returning to Concord, I wanted to have a sword fight one-on-one with the Deathclaw, and I tried my best to actually kill it, but the Deathclaw could just one-shot me and it was over. I was killed at least 30 plus times trying to get even 2 to 3 springs on the Deathclaw. Eventually, I gave up and I resorted to hiding inside a building and doing the good old swing and run tactic. Funny enough, the sword was actually dealing decent damage, if not great damage against an enemy that tanky and tough. Soon after all the swinging, the Deathclaw fell to the ground dead at the hands of my sword. Preston then awarded me with 50 fusion cells, which was very much needed for the musket. Speaking of needing fusion cells, I had just the plan to get some. The Brotherhood of Steel. At the Cambridge police station, I assisted Paladin Dance by chopping and whacking some of the ghouls within. Most of the ghouls were pretty easy, going down in 1 to 2 swings. After speaking with Dance, I looted the station, finding a few more fusion cells plus some stim packs, and I made for Arcjet. Now inside, I did the usual routine, but I did die once to a synth when I was too aggressive. I then played hide behind the power armor suit and wait for it to kill the scary bad guys. Inside the engine core is where my plan really came to fruition. The synths that attack Paladin Dance will never stop spawning, so well, I went AFK. For a long while, and when I returned there was a nice little stack of synth corpses for me to loot. I probably collected close to 800 fusion cells, which will set us up for pretty much the entire game because I will get more fusion cells later. Now before we continue the main story, I went back to the Museum of Freedom and got my revolutionary armor from the mod that I downloaded. The mod is on screen now if anyone is interested in getting it. It looked pretty dapper though if you ask me. With my new drip, I made my way over to Diamond City and spoke to the democratically elected mayor and defended freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Inside Diamond City, I purchased a bunch of junk that I needed to mod out my musket and make it much better. With the new and improved musket at my disposal, I went to take on the fools inside the hardware town. I took the frontal assault this time and started to zap the raiders. Demo was the hardest, taking 2 full cranks to kill. I think at this point it was like 3 cranks per time, so it took 6 shots to kill, but otherwise it was fairly smooth sailing, especially with dog meat tanking. I then made my way to Park Street Station. On the way, I destroyed the Freedom Trail Protectron because the wiki says it is British, which I think is wrong, but hey, we have to kill all those redcoats. Inside of the station, I began to clear the triggermen. For the first room, I used a musket mainly and it worked fine. The only trouble was when I got too aggressive and with the horrible fire of the musket, I would almost die pretty much instantly. Inside of the train track area, I continued to use my leverage and taking cover to pick off the triggermen. There was one triggerman though who took a whole lot of shots to kill, and then I switched to my revolutionary sword and took a head-on charge into the bullets, finishing off what was left of the scoundrels. Inside the main atrium of the vault, I used the musket again to pick off more triggermen and went through without too much resistance. Dino then took a musket snipe to the head and I spoke to Valentine. I escaped with a lot of ease and used the revolutionary sword pretty much the whole time. As for Skinny Malone, I missed the first few shots of my musket, which threw off the entire fight because whenever I miss, I have to reload again. I did manage to take out Skinny eventually though from swinging my sword, but it was definitely a very close call. Now my next goal was to help protect the USS Constitution. On my way to the ship, I dispatched a group of raiders who were giving me trouble. At the Constitution, I helped defend the ship from the scavengers who wanted to strip it for parts. I thoroughly enjoyed blasting and zapping them with democratic justice. That being said, most of the scavs were very thick, taking 2 or more shots to kill, which is a lot, especially when there are like 15 of them charging the ship. With the ship now secure though, I was tasked with some maintenance. First, I repaired the cables for the robots and I also fixed the power coils as well. I then spoke to a like-minded robot who tasked me with getting a navigation chip for their ship. The scavengers had taken that chip, so I went to speak with them. They suggested I commit an act of treason against the fine members of the Constitution.
Anyway, I started blasting. Bah! Bah!
Those filthy brutes in disguise soon felt the wrath of democracy and I grabbed the chip. I was then tasked with getting a transmitter located at a Poseidon energy plant. There was nothing but a few bugs within, so I grabbed the transmitter without much trouble and installed it onto the ship. Ironsides then sent me off to Fort Hagen. I mean, I was going to go there anyways, but I guess may as well mark it off the map early. Inside, I had to kill the synths like usual, and I was taking a lot of damage very fast, which kind of made me nervous for the Kellogg fight. Soon, I made it to the synth leader and zapped it as well, and grabbed the turbo thingy. I then returned to the Constitution again and powered it up. With the ship ready to sail the skies, the scavengers tried to make one last desperate ditch effort to foil the democratic actions of our beautiful nation. They did succeed once. However, with the power of democracy and lasers plus plot armor and a few cannon explosions, the scavengers were sent running for the hills. This fight, funny enough, was actually super fun, especially with just the sheer number of enemies and also how many people were just shooting at the ship. There was missile launches, it was just crazy fun. And then Ironside rewarded me with the Broadsider, which is literally a naval cannon you can walk around with. This is that secret weapon I mentioned in the intro that we'll use, but spoiler, it is quite shit, so I barely used it today and only really killed a few large beasts and some power armored units with it. I then flipped the auxiliary power and made the Constitution airborne. Now after single-handedly saving democracy, I spoke to Nick Valentine. I then looted everything that wasn't nailed down in Kellogg's home, from bullets to food and water. Dogmeat then got a good whiff of his cigar and I went back to Fort Hagen, which is something I never thought I would say. Inside the fort, the synths were not as difficult since I knew what to expect, and I blitzed through the first and second floors. I tried to use the Broadsider at some point and I was thoroughly underwhelmed by its strength, or lack thereof. After the synth though came the big bad Kellogg, who I initially was going to try and broadside to death, but after my first try I decided against it. On the second attempt I used the musket, which was much better. The only problem I had was shooting Kellogg, because I struggled to aim the weapon on a normal target, but an invisible man is a whole new problem. After many missed shots, Kellogg showed himself and I zapped him to death, plus also used a few swings from my revolutionary blade. The Brotherhood then showed up and I spoke to Nick Valentine, getting a nice idiot savant trigger, which gave me 2 levels that I greatly appreciate. I then modified the broadsider, and it's actually not the worst now that I can shoot multiple cannonballs. I then did the Diamond City's Blue quest, which is a staple of all my challenge runs. At the tap house, it went straight out of a Batman comic. With Paul sitting on his posterior by the end. Paul then paid me to deal with Cook. Now, unlike usual, I didn't just blast his head open yet, and I let him come to the chem deal. I returned to Paul and informed him Henry won't be a problem, and then proceeded to drop the most devious line ever.
I can see why his wife ran off.
I literally spat my water out laughing when I heard that beastly roast. The controlled substance suppliers managed to take me out once, but when I came with a fucking cannon in my hands, they stood no chance. I then reaped the rewards for my work and did not share with Cook, since I embody true capitalism and I'm not some filthy communist. At Good Neighbor, I continued to embody my true capitalist beliefs by using caveat emptor, hopefully I didn't butcher that, it just means buyer beware in Latin, when Finn tried his shenanigans. I protected my hard-earned money by using my musket to eliminate him. I then spoke to Dr. Amari using all the sarcastic options I could, since apparently George Washington was a humorous man in private. I then watched Kellogg's life story, which was nice and boring, and set out for the Glowing Sea. At the Glowing Sea, it was a war to reach Virgil. First, I had a battle with a Deathclaw who was zapped and then took multiple cannonballs to the face, belly, and, well, his entire body. Soon the Deathclaw fell to the ground dead, not cold, it was still warm because the body was irradiated. The next foe was a Rad Scorpion, and as you can imagine, that was much easier than fighting a Deathclaw, so no worries there. I then had a chat with the radiation lovers and bought some supplies off them. The final key enemy was another Deathclaw, and I actually had the high ground, and was taking sniper pot shots at the beast till it began running. Then I pursued it with my naval cannon in hand, ready to finish it off. I caught up with the Deathclaw and blasted it back to I don't know where. After all the fun, I had to listen to Virgil ramble and then off to kill a Corsair. At Green Tech Genetics, the first wave of gunners was a breeze, and despite me taking very high damage from them, they were in smaller groups, so I could kill them off before serious harm could befall me. Further in the building, the gunners actually did become a little bit more annoying and killed me a few times. However, after rethinking my strategy on how to deal with them, I was able to successfully kill them. This is including the missile launcher gunner, who I exploded before they could explode me. As for the Corsair, it went quite well, on my second attempt at least. I used the musket for a few shots and then I switched to my sword for the final few hits, since it staggered the Corsair, and not only did I deal extra damage to robots, I was getting quite low on HP, so I couldn't afford to take any extra damage. Soon the Corsair was shut down and I stole the chip outside of his head. To get the chip decoded, I went to the Old North Church and spoke to the railroad. I let Desdemona know I had the chip and she let me waltz right into their main headquarters, where a drug addict decoded one of the most powerful Institute technologies. I then took the code back to Virgil, who created the signal interceptor plans for me. Before I built the interceptor, I needed to help the Minutemen with their assistance of the settlers in 10 Pines Bluff. To do this, I was tasked with clearing Corvega, and as you can imagine, since I am a much higher level than when you get this mission, I pushed through the plant with literally no trouble, and I killed Jared with a snipe. I then showed Sturgis the signal interceptor plans and built a whole 2 interceptors because I can. Inside the institute, I spoke to Father and then all the division heads, which was boring as usual. First, I spoke to Ali, which is, well, boring. Then I spoke to Madison Lee, who for once I didn't have to recruit. Then I spoke to Jason, who's in synth retention. And finally, I spoke to the bioscience guy, who is so useless that I forget the name of him. The next task was to reclaim a rogue synth, at least that was something interesting. This synth had taken control of a raider group in Libertalia. The raiders here at Libertalia were not too bad, and I was only killed once by a mini nuke. Now, as we blast through these raiders, I want to explain why I will actually be siding with the Institute today. The first reason is, well, I haven't done a video with them yet, and they are next in line. Now, you also may say it's not very democratic by having a director as the leader, but George Washington was a Freemason, so why not pretend he was part of another secret underground society? Plus, the Brotherhood of Steel also pretty much has a dictator, but they steal, so that's not very capitalist. The Minutemen is more of a militia, so of course I'm not going to side with a bunch of terrorists, and the Railroad free slaves, but Washington had a fair share of slaves. So in the end, despite the flaws of the Institute, it is probably the most befitting, which is why I sided with them. After fighting through the raiders, I reached the synth and used the recall code. I then blasted his mates back to Timbuktu. Next up today was Bunker Hill, which wasn't too bad. I had upgraded my laser musket and put a focuser on the end and made it 5 cranks. This turned the puny Lego gun into a fucking railgun. It was crazy. This new railgun proceeded to rail everything from Brotherhood of Steel Knights in full power armor to armored railroad heavies. After killing off just about everything to ever exist, I reached the group of pathetic synths and extorted them for caps. Now, since I am a true capitalist, I also wanted money for reclaiming them, so I still used the recall code. I then finished off what was left of the railroad outside, and also had a man tell me his son wanted to join the railroad. Yep, tell the man who just blasted about 15 of the railroad members into oblivion. Very good idea. Father then held a mothers meeting which I attended, where he named me the leader of the mothers group. I took that role with honor and dignity, and then I was shipped off to war at Mass Fusion. Inside Mass Fusion, I began to notice how bad it is to not have real armor. If the Brotherhood Knights in power armor especially looked at me funny, I would just fall to the ground and die. The first floor was tough, since I was trying to figure out how I would maneuver and fight the soldiers. On the elevator ride down, I did a little hunting though and killed a couple vermin who actually tried to fight back. Once the elevator crashed, one of the hardest fights of the run started. I was surrounded by about 5 Brotherhood soldiers who could kill me very fast. Initially, I was going to try and kill the power armored soldier first, but then I realized the best target were the weak ones, since I could instantly kill them and that would reduce the amount of damage I take. I then ran for cover behind a door and finished off what remained of the soldiers. Can we also admire me shooting this missile out of the air? I then grabbed the agitator and used up some of my RAD-away. As for the sentry bot, well, I used a plethora of weapons to kill it. The first few hits I used the laser musket to deal some early damage, and then soon I switched to the broadsider since it could stagger the sentry bot and deal damage across its whole entire body. The sentry took about 10 cannon shots and then it went kaboom. As for the assaultron, well, I used a sneak attack to instantly kill one, and then I just blasted the other in 2 hits. I was then tasked with the retrieval of an extremely intelligent man named Wallace. He had hired some gunners to protect himself from me. Of course, I just dispatched all the gunners in a few seconds and a few blasts. I then had a chat with Wallace who wouldn't open the door, so they relayed a synth to deal with him. I also found out Wallace was not only very intelligent, but he was immortal, and he wouldn't die from lasers or slashes from my sword. Back at the Institute, I powered the reactor to ensure the future of mankind, and then attended the director's meeting as the soon-to-be director of the Institute. After the meeting with Father, I had a chat where he tasked me with killing the railroad, in spite of me saying no, I won't do it. I guess no means yes in the Fallout world. That makes consent a whole lot more complicated. On my way to rail the railroad, I was blasted by Glory and ended quite quickly. Resurrecting from the dead, I blasted Glory first in the head to eliminate her. I then played Ringer Rosie around a pole and just kept taking pot shots at the railroad members who couldn't really hurt me with their weak pipe weapons. Now, with one less enemy toward the Institute, it was time to eliminate the final enemy, the Brotherhood of Steel. I spoke to Dr. Lee, who filled me in on a plan for an espionage style attack where I teleport in and destroy their EM fields that stop the synths from teleporting. Before we began this set attack, I went to Diamond City and purchased even more supplies for the battle, especially focusing on cannonballs for 2 reasons. A, it was funny, and B, since I had enough fusion cells. I finished with 136 cannonballs to my name after waiting for many days and constantly buying them. Teleporting to the Boston airport, it was time to engage in the final battle. Now, this fight was actually the hardest part of the run, I can say that very much, which is actually quite befitting since it is the final fight. I started off by sniping off as many Brotherhood soldiers as I could to give me a better chance at reaching the reactor in a head-on assault. This wasn't a fast endeavor and probably took 10 to 20 minutes to kill off as many soldiers as possible. I then tried the head-on charge and realized that it was a no-go no matter what I tried, whether it be chems, Nuka-Cola, stim packs, nothing would get past the amount of Brotherhood soldiers that were there and the amount of damage that I just took. Instead, I made my way around the back of the airport into the loading dock. Here, I killed a few scribes and knights plus Proctor Quinlan. Now, the first generator was in sight, but was not the easiest to deal with. First, I forced the vertibird to begin flying, and then I tried to kill the soldiers surrounding the generator so I could destroy it. However, this was fruitless since I kept getting killed by the Brotherhood because of my weak protection. I then remembered, wait, I'm being a dumbass, I can just shoot the generator from afar, which would allow synths to relay in and support me. That was 1 generator down and 2 to go. As for the second generator, well, I still had synths supporting me push through. There was a platoon of soldiers guarding it, but after they died, I destroyed that generator as well. I then went up and destroyed the third and final generator since there was nothing but robots guarding it. Now this is where the chaos really ensues, with all the synths being able to teleport in. I then made my way to Liberty Prime and commenced the defense of the virus synth, that actually rhymes. I did this by blasting any of the soldiers who came near. At one point, a vertibird crashed into the synth and killed it, but I persevered to complete the mission even though I was severely injured. This was cut short when Elder Maxon arrived and killed me in probably 3 seconds flat. I hadn't saved at all till this point, so I had to destroy the generators again. Back where I left off, I learned my lesson, Maxon cannot land, so I drugged up and pulled out my handheld fucking cannon and blasted their asses till the vertibird exploded and it was over. I then defended against what was left of the Brotherhood and the virus was completed. Liberty Prime then used the power of democracy to blast the Brotherhood airship out of the sky, and I was teleported to enjoy the show. I then watched Father die and answered the question with a yes, you can beat Fallout 4 as a founding father. This run was probably one of the easier runs until the final fight, which took multiple attempts and about an hour to complete. I was very surprised to learn though that the laser musket is actually insanely strong, and for a weapon you get with no real hurdles, it can literally carry you through the game without any real issues, especially if you modify it and have some real armor. The armor was probably the hardest part of today's run because it made me extremely weak and susceptible to enemy fire, especially towards the end of the game. Lucky for me, this was offset by the laser musket's strength, and surprisingly, how well the broadsider could actually deal with heavy targets. The only real issue with the broadsider was it was just shit at aiming, you couldn't really aim it at all. I did genuinely enjoy this playthrough though, and I am excited to see what other videos I could make. Now if you did enjoy, you must subscribe to the channel because we are pushing for 500 subscribers and your help is very much appreciated. Now I just want to say I thank you all for watching and I hope to see you in the next one.